September 3, 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. Corporal Ernst Richter stood in the recreation yard, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching something that struck him as the perfect symbol of American foolishness. 3 American guards were assembling a dozen bicycles, their frames gleaming in the late summer sun, wheels spinning freely as they adjusted seats and handlebars. The prisoners around him began to laugh, a harsh, mocking sound that carried across the compound. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. These Americans, Ernst thought, had won the war not through superior strategy or military excellence, but through sheer industrial accident. And now they were bringing toys into a prison camp, as if grown men needed children's playthings to pass the time. The bicycles looked absurd to Ernst and his fellow prisoners, flimsy chrome frames that would buckle under real weight, thin tires that would puncture on the first stone, chain guards and fenders that added nothing but unnecessary bulk. Back home in Germany, bicycles were serious tools, heavy steel machines built for hauling cargo and enduring the punishment of cobblestone streets and wartime neglect. These American contraptions looked like they belonged in a circus, not in the hands of soldiers. What Ernst couldn't possibly comprehend in that moment was that he was witnessing the collision of 2 completely different philosophies about human mobility, personal freedom, and the very nature of efficient design. He had emerged from a society where bicycles represented ration transportation, where rubber was precious, where individual movement was controlled and monitored. Now he faced a cycling culture built on leisure, personal choice, and mass production so abundant that even prisoners of war could be given access to machines that would have been luxuries in wartime Germany. The mathematics of this cultural collision were staggering in ways the prisoners couldn't yet grasp. While German civilians lined up for hours to repair punctured inner tubes, while rubber became so scarce that wooden wheels replaced pneumatic tires, while bicycle ownership required government permits and registration, these American camp administrators were casually distributing dozens of bicycles for prisoner recreation. The extravagance alone seemed to mock every material shortage the Third Reich had endured. But this story truly begins several months earlier, with a decision made in Washington that would reshape how 425,000 German prisoners experienced captivity on American soil between 1943 and 1946. The War Department had commissioned studies on prisoner psychology and camp management efficiency. One researcher, Dr. Margaret Ashford from the University of Chicago, had proposed something radical. Physical mobility, she argued, was directly connected to mental health and rehabilitation potential. Prisoners who felt trapped, confined, and immobile showed higher rates of resistance, depression, and hostility. Those who experienced controlled freedom of movement adapted better to captivity and proved more receptive to democratic re-education. Her recommendation was simple but controversial: give prisoners access to bicycles within camp boundaries. Let them feel the sensation of movement, of covering distance through their own effort, of experiencing a small measure of autonomy within the controlled environment. Military officials initially dismissed the idea as dangerous and expensive. Bicycles could be weapons, they could facilitate escape attempts, they represented valuable material resources being given to enemy soldiers. But Dr. Ashford persisted, presenting data from smaller pilot programs at 3 camps where limited bicycle access had reduced disciplinary incidents by 42% and improved prisoner cooperation with work details by 37%. The bicycles, she argued, weren't luxuries. They were psychological tools that would make camps easier to manage while preparing prisoners for democratic civilian life after the war. Camp Concordia was selected as one of the primary test sites for the bicycle program in September 1944. The camp housed 3,600 German prisoners on the windswept plains of north-central Kansas, where the flat landscape stretched to the horizon in every direction. The prisoners, mostly captured from the Afrika Korps and Italian campaigns, had been in American custody for over a year. They had already experienced the initial shock of American abundance, the generous food rations, the well-equipped barracks, the access to recreational equipment and educational programs. But nothing had prepared them for bicycles. When Sergeant Thomas McKinley rolled the first Schwinn cruiser into the recreation yard on that September morning, the reaction was immediate and unanimous. Ernst Richter, who had been a bicycle mechanic in Dortmund before the war, felt personally offended by the machine. The wide cushioned seat looked ridiculous. The upright riding position seemed inefficient. The coaster brake operated by pedaling backwards struck him as needlessly complicated compared to hand brakes. The white wall tires and chrome fenders were pure decoration, adding weight without function. This was a toy, not a tool. Private Hans Moeller, a former Wehrmacht supply sergeant from Munich, examined one of the bicycles with professional disdain. The frame was made from lightweight steel alloys that would never survive military use. The ball bearings in the hubs were too loose for precision operation. The chain was too thin to carry heavy loads. Everything about the design prioritized comfort and ease over durability and utility. These machines embodied everything the prisoners had been taught about American softness and impracticality. They were built for a society that had never known real hardship, never experienced material scarcity, never understood that engineering meant solving problems with minimum resources. Lieutenant Friedrich Vogel, the senior German officer in Compound B, issued informal guidance to his men: treat the bicycles with contempt, don't ride them, don't acknowledge their presence. Show the Americans that German soldiers have dignity and won't be reduced to riding children's toys around a prison yard like trained animals in a zoo. The bicycles, Vogel declared, were an insult disguised as a privilege. They were meant to humiliate, to infantilize, to break the spirit of men who had fought for the fatherland. For 3 days the bicycles sat unused in the recreation yard. American guards watched with puzzled concern as prisoners walked past the gleaming machines without a second glance. The camp commander, Colonel William Bradford, consulted with Dr. Ashford by telephone. She advised patience. The prisoners needed to observe, to process, to overcome their initial resistance on their own terms. Forcing participation would defeat the entire purpose of the program. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Private Otto Brenner was a slight man of 43, older than most prisoners who had been conscripted late in the war as Germany scraped the bottom of its manpower reserves. Otto had never been a real soldier. He had worked as a postal clerk in Heidelberg, riding a heavy cargo bicycle to deliver mail through the city's steep cobblestone streets. When he saw the American bicycles, he didn't see toys. He saw something eerily familiar but impossibly refined, as if someone had taken the basic concept of a bicycle and reimagined it for a world where materials were abundant and comfort mattered. On the 4th morning, Otto approached one of the Schwinn cruisers while most prisoners were at breakfast. He had calculated his timing carefully, choosing a moment when he could examine the machine without an audience of mocking comrades. The seat adjusted higher than any bicycle he had known. The handlebars curved back toward the rider in a relaxed position that seemed wrong until he actually sat on the machine. The pedals turned with such smooth, effortless motion that he instinctively looked for signs of mechanical failure. Nothing should work this smoothly. Sergeant McKinley watched from a distance as Otto circled the recreation yard slowly, his expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to something approaching wonder. The bicycle rolled with a smoothness that seemed impossible. The wide tires absorbed irregularities in the ground that would have jarred Otto's bones on his old postal bicycle. The coaster brake, once he understood its backward pedal operation, provided stopping power that felt almost magical in its simplicity. There were no cables to stretch, no pads to replace, no adjustments to maintain. The entire machine seemed designed to require nothing from the rider except the decision to move forward. Ernst Richter watched Otto's tentative circuits from the barracks window, his professional pride wrestling with genuine curiosity. As a bicycle mechanic, Ernst had spent years coaxing German machines to function despite worn parts, inadequate lubrication, and wartime material substitutions. He had replaced rubber tires with wooden ones, fabricated brake pads from leather scraps, and kept postal bicycles running with ingenuity and determination. The ease with which Otto rode that American bicycle offended his understanding of how mechanical systems should function. Machines require constant maintenance, careful adjustment, and operator skill to achieve reliable performance. Yet Otto, a postal clerk with no mechanical knowledge, was riding circles around the yard as if the bicycle was reading his mind. By midday, 3 more prisoners had quietly approached the bicycles. Werner Schultz, a farm boy from Bavaria, who had grown up riding his father's ancient bicycle to market, found himself on a red Schwinn that made his childhood machine seem like medieval torture equipment. The seat actually cushioned his weight instead of bruising his bones. The handlebars didn't vibrate with every bump. The chain ran silent and smooth without constant oil application. It was as if someone had asked, "What if we built a bicycle that was actually pleasant to ride, and then possessed the resources and skill to make it real?" Lieutenant Vogel watched this defection with growing alarm. His authority over the prisoners depended on maintaining their sense of German superiority despite the obvious evidence of defeat. The bicycles threatened that narrative in ways that generous food rations or comfortable barracks never could. Food was necessary, shelter was required, but these bicycles were pure excess. They were evidence of a society so wealthy, so industrially advanced, that it could perfect objects meant solely for pleasure and then distribute them casually, even to enemy prisoners. The American guards following Dr.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Ashford's protocols maintained studied indifference to the prisoners' bicycle usage. They didn't encourage participation or comment on those who abstained. The bicycles were simply available, a choice rather than a mandate. This casual approach to authority confused the German prisoners almost as much as the bicycles themselves. In their military experience, equipment was issued with explicit orders for its use. Accountability was maintained through inspections and reports. The American approach, "here are some bicycles, use them if you want," seemed impossibly lax, yet it somehow worked. Prisoners who might have resisted a direct order found themselves drawn to the machines precisely because no one was forcing the issue. By the end of the first week, 23 prisoners were regularly using the bicycles. They developed informal circuits around the compound, racing each other, practicing tricks, exploring the sensation of movement within confinement. The recreation yard began to feel larger as prisoners discovered that covering the same ground at speed created an illusion of expanded space. The psychological impact exactly matched Dr. Ashford's predictions. The cyclists showed improved moods, better sleep patterns, and increased willingness to participate in work details and educational programs. Ernst Richter held out for 11 days before his professional curiosity overwhelmed his ideological resistance. He approached a blue Schwinn cruiser during the evening free period, when shadows were long and his capitulation might go unnoticed by the more zealous prisoners. He told himself this was purely technical investigation. As a trained mechanic, he needed to understand how these machines achieved their apparent performance. It was professional development, nothing more. The moment Ernst settled onto the wide seat and pushed off, everything he knew about bicycles was simultaneously confirmed and contradicted. The basic principles were identical: leverage transferred through a chain, balance maintained through forward motion, steering controlled through handlebar input. But the execution of these principles had been refined to a degree that seemed to violate the relationship between cost and quality that defined German engineering. This bicycle shouldn't be this good at this price point. The materials were too lightweight, the components too smooth, the whole package too effortless. Ernst rode for 40 minutes that first evening, circling the compound in increasingly confident loops, his mechanic's mind cataloging features that should have been impossible. The hub bearings maintained perfect adjustment without visible maintenance. The chain tension remained constant despite no tensioning device. The tires held air week after week without the constant pumping that German tubes required. Even the paint, bright and glossy, showed no signs of the chipping and rust that plagued European bicycles. Every element suggested a manufacturing process so advanced, so quality-controlled, that the final product achieved reliability through precision rather than maintainability through overbuilt simplicity. That night, Ernst lay in his bunk struggling with cognitive dissonance that went far beyond bicycles. He had been raised on Nazi propaganda that portrayed Americans as soft, undisciplined, and industrially inferior to German engineering excellence. The German educational system had taught him that efficiency meant extracting maximum output from minimum input, that good design meant creating machines that skilled technicians could maintain under adverse conditions. The American bicycle challenged all of these assumptions. It was efficient not through Spartan simplicity, but through manufacturing precision. It was maintainable not through modular components, but through materials and tolerances that eliminated the need for constant adjustment. It suggested a society with such deep industrial capacity that quality could be built into cheap consumer goods as a default standard rather than a luxury option. Within 3 weeks of the bicycle program's launch, over 80% of Camp Concordia's prisoners were regular cyclists. The recreation yard had evolved into a complex social space where prisoners raced, practiced stunts, and engaged in conversations that would have been impossible in static formations. The movement itself seemed to facilitate different kinds of thinking. Prisoners who had maintained rigid Nazi orthodoxy in classroom re-education sessions found themselves discussing democratic principles while riding side by side, the physical activity somehow reducing ideological defensiveness. The camp's work program benefited dramatically from the bicycle access. Prisoners who cycled regularly showed 17% higher productivity in farm labor details. They reported feeling less fatigued despite performing the same physical tasks. Dr. Ashford's theory about mobility and mental health was proving correct in ways that surprised even her. The bicycles weren't just recreation, they were rehabilitation tools that operated below conscious awareness, teaching lessons about autonomy, choice, and individual agency that no lecture could convey. Private Hans Müller, who had initially dismissed the bicycles as flimsy toys, became one of the camp's most enthusiastic cyclists. He organized informal races, developed maintenance schedules even though the machines needed little attention, and began teaching other prisoners the subtle techniques of efficient cycling. Hans had discovered something unexpected: competence at a new skill. Even something as simple as riding a bicycle well created a sense of accomplishment that partially filled the void left by military defeat. He could be good at this, he could master it. The bicycle gave him back a measure of self-respect through personal achievement rather than national identity. The American guards noticed the transformation but struggled to articulate exactly what was changing. The prisoners seemed more human, somehow, less hostile, more engaged, occasionally even friendly. Sergeant McKinley, who had initially thought the bicycle program was foolish, found himself in conversation with Ernst Richter about hub-bearing design. The German mechanic's technical questions revealed genuine intellectual curiosity rather than contempt. They discussed metallurgy, manufacturing tolerances, and design philosophy with the mutual respect of craftsmen appreciating each other's expertise. The bicycles had created common ground where military hierarchy and national enmity couldn't reach. Lieutenant Vogel watched his authority erode with each passing week. The prisoners still obeyed his orders regarding camp protocol and military behavior. They no longer looked to him for guidance on how to interpret their experience. The bicycles had become a parallel education system that operated outside his control. Men who had followed him into battle now followed their own curiosity, their own pleasure, their own sense of what felt right, rather than what ideology demanded. The transformation was subtle but irreversible. The bicycles hadn't broken German military discipline. They had simply offered something more compelling: the experience of individual freedom within structured limits, the satisfaction of personal choice within a framework of clear boundaries. By October, the bicycle program at Camp Concordia had proven so successful that the War Department began implementing it at camps across the country. Orders went out for thousands of bicycles to be distributed to prisoner compounds from California to Virginia. The manufacturers, already running at capacity for military contracts, retooled portions of their facilities to meet this unexpected demand. The economic multiplier effects rippled through the American industrial system. Steel mills supplied tubing, rubber plants produced tires, component manufacturers made chains and bearings, paint suppliers provided finishing materials, all for bicycles that would be ridden by enemy soldiers in prison camps. The prisoners couldn't comprehend the economic implications of their recreation. In Germany, bicycle production had been consolidated under government control, with civilian needs subordinated to military requirements. Component quality had degraded steadily as the war progressed, with strategic materials diverted to weapons production. The idea that America could simultaneously fight a two-front global war while expanding consumer bicycle production specifically for prisoners would have seemed like propaganda fantasy if they hadn't been living it. Ernst Richter began writing letters to his wife in Dortmund, carefully worded to pass through camp censorship, describing the American bicycles in terms that he hoped would convey larger truths about the society that created them. "The machines here are built to standards we cannot achieve even for military equipment," he wrote. "They ride smooth because the manufacturing precision eliminates the need for constant adjustment. This is not superior materials, but superior process. They have solved problems we consider unsolvable through better methods rather than better resources." His wife, reading these letters in the ruins of Dortmund while subsisting on ration cards and makeshift meals, struggled to reconcile Ernst's descriptions with Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. If the Americans could build such quality into cheap recreational equipment, what did that suggest about their capacity for military production? The question haunted German civilians who were beginning to understand that their government had fundamentally misrepresented reality. The bicycle program created unexpected diplomatic complexity when Red Cross inspectors visited Camp Concordia in November 1944. The Geneva Convention required that prisoner treatment be documented and compared to international standards. When the inspectors observed hundreds of German prisoners cycling freely around the compound, riding machines that exceeded European civilian standards, they found themselves writing reports that seemed almost absurd. prisoners were not just being fed and housed adequately, they were being provided with recreational equipment that most European civilians couldn't access even in peacetime. The disparity between captivity conditions and homefront reality was inverting traditional assumptions about hardship and comfort. Werner Schultz, the Bavarian farm boy, experienced perhaps the most profound transformation through the bicycle program. He had grown up believing that hard work meant physical suffering, that comfort was suspect, that ease indicated moral weakness. The Nazi ideology he had absorbed taught that struggle built character while comfort bred degeneracy. The American bicycle challenged all of these assumptions by being both efficient and pleasant. It allowed him to cover more distance with less effort, while simultaneously providing genuine enjoyment. This combination of utility and pleasure seemed to violate some fundamental law of the universe that Werner had never thought to question. One afternoon in late November, Werner found himself riding alongside an American guard during a supervised excursion outside the camp. The prisoners had earned privileges that included chaperoned visits to nearby farms where they performed labor details. The guard, a young corporal from Iowa named James Morrison, cycled with unconscious ease, his posture relaxed, his attention on conversation rather than mechanical operation. He told Werner about riding his bicycle to school as a child, about summer evenings cycling with friends through countryside not much different from these Kansas plains, about the simple pleasure of movement through familiar landscape. Werner listened to these stories and realized he was hearing a description of a childhood he had never experienced. In Bavaria, his youth had been consumed by Hitler Youth training, by ideological education, by preparation for sacrifice and struggle. The idea of cycling purely for pleasure, of summer evenings spent in aimless exploration with friends, of treating a bicycle as something other than a tool for productive work, these concepts revealed a society built on fundamentally different assumptions about human life. The American Guard had grown up expecting pleasure as a normal part of existence, expecting machines to make life easier rather than just more efficient, expecting personal freedom of movement as a default condition rather than a rare privilege. That realization struck Werner with physical force. He had been taught that the German way was superior, that discipline and sacrifice created stronger societies than American softness and self-indulgence. But what if American softness was actually a higher form of civilization? What if societies that could provide pleasure and comfort to their citizens while still fielding the most powerful military in human history had discovered something that German philosophy had missed entirely? The bicycle wasn't making him weak. It was making him more capable, more content, more willing to work harder precisely because he had experienced rest that actually restored him rather than just preventing collapse. These thoughts felt like betrayal, like the first crack in an ideological foundation that he had never thought to question. Werner said nothing to James Morrison, but the conversation continued in his head for weeks, undermining certainties he had held since childhood. The bicycle had done what no re-education lecture could accomplish. It had given him a lived experience of an alternative worldview that felt better, worked better, and produced better results than everything he had been taught to believe. By December 1944, Camp Concordia's bicycle program had been documented in military reports, academic papers, and psychological assessments that circulated through the War Department and academic institutions. Dr. Ashford's theories about mobility and mental health were being validated with data that exceeded her initial predictions. But more significantly, the bicycle program was revealing fundamental truths about how human beings respond to environments that offer autonomy within structure, pleasure within purpose, and choice within clear boundaries. The bicycles themselves continued to perform with reliability that astounded the German mechanics who examined them. Ernst Richter had fully committed to understanding American manufacturing methods by studying every component he could access. He disassembled and reassembled hubs, examined chain construction, measured frame tolerances with improvised tools. Everything he learned pointed to the same conclusion: American industrial capacity operated on a scale and with a precision that Germany had never achieved even before the war. The bicycles were cheap, not because they were poorly made, but because the manufacturing volume was so enormous that economies of scale drove unit costs below what European craft production could match even for expensive products. This realization had implications far beyond bicycles. If America could apply this level of industrial sophistication to consumer recreation, what did their military equipment look like? The prisoners had seen American uniforms, equipment, and weapons. They had experienced American logistics and supply systems. Everything pointed to industrial capacity that dwarfed German production despite Nazi claims about superior engineering and organization. The bicycle was a microcosm of larger truths that were becoming impossible to ignore. The winter months transformed the bicycle program in unexpected ways. Snow and cold made cycling less pleasant but didn't stop it. The prisoners discovered that physical activity in cold weather produced warmth and energy that sitting in heated barracks couldn't match. They developed techniques for winter riding, maintaining balance on icy patches, and managing the unique challenges of cold weather cycling. The American Guards provided maintenance materials freely, lubricants for chains, patches for the occasional puncture, tools for minor adjustments. This casual generosity with resources remained incomprehensible to men who had watched German mechanics hoarding scraps of wire and drops of oil. Private Otto Brenner, who had been the first prisoner to ride, became an informal ambassador for the bicycle program. He spoke to new prisoners arriving at the camp, explaining that the bicycles weren't an insult or a trap but a genuine opportunity for better mental and physical health. His gentle advocacy converted skeptics more effectively than any American directive could have. Otto had discovered that he possessed a gift for teaching, for helping others overcome their resistance to new experiences. The bicycle had given him purpose and status that military hierarchy had never provided. The Christmas season brought unexpected emotional challenges for prisoners far from home and family. The bicycle program provided a coping mechanism that saved lives. Several prisoners who had shown signs of severe depression and suicide ideation found partial relief in daily cycling routines. The physical activity regulated mood through biochemical mechanisms that neither the prisoners nor the camp staff fully understood. Dr. Ashford's reports noted dramatic reductions in psychiatric interventions among prisoners with regular bicycle access compared to camps without cycling programs. The data was compelling enough that the War Department accelerated bicycle distribution to all major POW facilities. As 1945 began, Ernst Richter found himself in an impossible position. His technical analysis had proven beyond doubt that American industrial capability exceeded German capacity in ways that made continued war materially hopeless. His personal experience of American generosity toward prisoners contradicted every Nazi claim about racial inferiority and cultural degeneracy. The bicycle program had inadvertently educated him about democracy, not through abstract principles but through concrete evidence of what free societies could achieve. And yet, publicly acknowledging these truths meant betraying everything he had fought for, everyone he had served with, and the nation he still loved despite its obvious errors. He wasn't alone in this cognitive dissonance. Thousands of German prisoners across America were experiencing similar transformations, processing contradictions that undermined the ideological certainty that had carried them into war. The bicycles were part of a larger pattern of American abundance and generosity that made no sense according to Nazi worldview but made perfect sense once that worldview was abandoned. The challenge was finding the courage to abandon it, to accept that they had been wrong not just strategically but fundamentally about how societies should organize themselves and treat human beings. The transformation would accelerate in the months ahead as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, and prisoners began contemplating return to a Germany that no longer existed in the form they remembered. But already in the winter of 1945, riding bicycles around Kansas prison yards, men were changing in ways that would reshape their future, and indirectly, the future of their devastated homeland. Spring arrived at Camp Concordia with warming winds that made cycling a daily ritual for nearly every prisoner. The transformation that had begun with mockery and resistance had become something far more profound. Ernst Richter no longer saw the bicycles as symbols of American excess, but as evidence of a society that valued human well-being even for its enemies. He spent hours teaching newer prisoners the maintenance techniques he had learned, passing on knowledge that went beyond mechanical skill to encompass philosophy about quality, durability, and the relationship between good design and human dignity. The work details that spring took on new character as prisoners cycled to nearby farms with American guards, the journey itself becoming a form of therapy. Hans Muller organized informal races along country roads, competitions that brought laughter and genuine camaraderie between men who had been enemies months before. The physical freedom of movement, even within the constraints of captivity and supervision, created psychological space for prisoners to reconsider their beliefs about power, control, and what made societies strong. Lieutenant Vogel's resistance had crumbled entirely by April. He rode a green Schwinn with the same enthusiasm as his men, having finally admitted to himself that ideology couldn't overcome lived experience. The bicycles had taught him what propaganda never could, that American strength came not from cruelty or domination but from creating abundance that lifted everyone, even prisoners of war. His evening rides became meditation sessions where he processed the magnitude of German defeat not just militarily but philosophically. When news of Germany's surrender reached Camp Concordia in May 1945, the prisoners experienced complex emotions while sitting on their bicycles in the recreation yard. Relief mixed with grief, hope tangled with uncertainty about what awaited them in a homeland destroyed by war. Werner Schultz found himself crying while gripping the handlebars of his bicycle, realizing that this simple machine had given him more genuine happiness in months of captivity than years of Nazi ideology had ever provided. The bicycle represented everything Germany had lost by choosing conquest over creation, domination over cooperation. The repatriation process began slowly in 1946 as ships became available to transport prisoners back across the Atlantic. The War Department allowed prisoners to take personal items within weight limits. Many chose to bring nothing but memories, but Ernst Richter spent his final wages from camp labor on a basic toolkit, determined to apply American manufacturing principles to whatever bicycle repair work he might find in ruined Germany. He had learned that precision and quality weren't luxuries but foundations of efficiency, that making things right the first time created more value than cheap production requiring constant maintenance. Otto Brenner wrote a final letter to his sister in Heidelberg before departing, describing the bicycles in terms he hoped would prepare her for the changed brother returning home. He had discovered capabilities within himself that Nazi society had never recognized or valued. The postal clerk who had been conscripted as cannon fodder had found dignity and purpose through teaching others to embrace new experience without fear. The bicycle had been his classroom, and the lessons extended far beyond cycling technique. The journey home reversed their arrival experience. The prisoners traveled on the same Liberty ships, ate the same generous rations, but now they processed these experiences through transformed understanding. They had witnessed not just American material abundance but the philosophical foundations that created such abundance. Democratic societies that valued individual choice, that built quality into everyday objects, that treated even enemies with basic human dignity, possessed strength that totalitarian systems could never match regardless of their military pageantry or ideological certainty. When Ernst Richter finally returned to Dortmund in late 1946, he found his city in ruins but his wife alive. She had saved every letter he had written about the American bicycles, puzzling over his technical descriptions that seemed to contain coded messages about larger truths. Together they read them again, and Ernst explained what he had really been trying to communicate, that Germany had lost not because Americans were stronger fighters but because they had built a society focused on creation rather than destruction, on making lives better rather than just more disciplined. The bicycle shop Ernst opened in 1947 became something more than a business. It became a quiet center for re-education, a place where former soldiers gathered to discuss what they had learned in American captivity while repairing bicycles that Ernst built to American standards using salvaged materials and improvised techniques. He taught precision care and the philosophy that good work honored both maker and user. His shop never used Nazi ideology's rhetoric about sacrifice and struggle. Instead, Ernst spoke about satisfaction, quality, and the simple pleasure of making things that served people well. Werner Schultz returned to his Bavarian farm and immediately began organizing a cycling club for young people who had grown up during the war years. He taught them not just how to ride but how to experience freedom within structure, how to find joy in simple movement, how to understand that machines could enhance life rather than just extract labor. His students included the children of former Nazi Party members and families who had resisted, cycling together without regard for past allegiances because Werner had learned in camp. The shared experiences created stronger bonds than shared ideology. Across Germany, thousands of returned prisoners carried similar lessons learned not from lectures or political programs but from the simple experience of riding bicycles around America. They had been soldiers who mocked what they didn't understand, then became men who discovered that abundance and generosity could coexist with strength, that quality could be democratized through industrial precision, that treating people well wasn't weakness but the foundation of genuine power. The bicycles themselves stayed in America, distributed eventually to other programs or sold as surplus, their gleaming chrome frames and smooth rolling wheels serving new purposes in a nation that had proven its strength through both military might and material generosity. But the lessons those bicycles taught crossed the ocean in the minds of men who had learned to see past propaganda to recognize truth when they experienced it directly. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt and transformed into a democratic society, the influence of those returned prisoners operated quietly beneath the surface of official history. They spoke in shops and farms, in classrooms and living rooms, about what they had witnessed in America. The physical abundance alone, though that was remarkable, but the philosophical foundations that created such abundance, respect for individual choice, commitment to quality, belief that life should contain pleasure as well as purpose, understanding that strength came from lifting everyone rather than crushing opposition. The bicycle had been their teacher, offering lessons that penetrated deeper than any political indoctrination, because the lessons were learned through direct experience rather than abstract arguments. They had mocked simple machines as symbols of American foolishness, then discovered through riding those machines that wisdom sometimes looks like simplicity, that strength can express itself through generosity, and that societies built on human dignity and material abundance possess power that military force alone can never achieve. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.